Welcome to this Greener UK event on what ending the Brexit transition period on the 31st of December, with or without a deal, will mean for the environment. My name is Shaun Spiers, Chair of Greener UK, and I'll be steering the discussion over the next hour. Yesterday, Karen Fairbairn, Director General of the CBI, wrote about the air of resignation surrounding the Brexit talks. And it is remarkable, even given COVID-19, how little attention the talks are getting from MPs and the wider public. We do all indeed seem resigned to accept whatever outcome the negotiators arrive at. To be clear, this debate is not about Brexit. Brexit is done and dusted. It's a debate about whether we finally leave the EU ambit with a deal, what sort of deal we get, and whether we have institutions in place across the UK to ensure that environmental rules are upheld. All this has huge implications for environmental law, farming in the countryside, marine conservation, chemical safety, climate action, and much else. With us to debate these questions, we have three experts. Jill Rutter, a senior research fellow at the think tank UK in a Changing Europe and a former senior civil servant with posts in Treasury, Number 10 and DEFRA. David Baldock is a senior fellow and former executive director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP, and a member of the Greener UK board. And Maria Lee is professor of law at University College London, focusing on environment law. Now, before we get going, a few rules of engagement. First, you'll see two buttons at the bottom of your screen, one for chat and one a Q&A button. You're welcome to use the chat function to talk among yourselves, as it were, but if you want the panelists to answer your questions, please use the Q&A function. And if somebody has posed a question that you like, you can use the thumbs up icon to make it more likely that it will be asked. And collating all the questions is Sarah Williams, the head of the Greener UK unit. She'll be looking at the questions asked today and also questions that have been posed in advance. I'm also joined in the background by Ollie Mount, Green Alliance's events manager, who should be able to handle any technical glitches. So, on with the show. And I'd like to start by asking Jill, Jill, if you could set out the wider context of the negotiations. Greener UK is obviously trying to land some points about the environment, just as the CBI and the TUC are trying to land some points about the economy. But the government seems absolutely committed to ending the transition on the 31st of December, come what may. What's driving them?
So the government, so where we are, we're currently in round 4 of the talks. That's happening this week. There are a lot of sessions scheduled on what is called level playing field, which is where the environment, those provisions come into the negotiations. The government, I think, has taken the view that it's got to get Brexit done. Politically, it sets a big store behind ending the transition at the end of the year. They have said that they want the regulatory flexibility that will give the ability to conclude new trade deals, which they could negotiate but can't conclude while the UK is still in transition. They've also said that they are worried about potential liability to any future EU COVID bailout beyond that, although that was brushed aside last week at the Institute for Government when Barnier's spokesman Stefan de Rink said the UK would negotiate a one-off lump sum in a transition and wouldn't have open-ended liabilities. And I think, you know, the political momentum is there. They also, I think that if they agree a transition, that doesn't make it any quicker to conclude a deal, that it will take the foot off the pedal, and all you will get in an extension is basically a sort of fallow period where everybody goes back and concentrates on dealing with COVID and things like that, and that they would find themselves in exactly the same position as they do now, with big ideological differences between the two sides in a year's time, or in 2 years' time if they went for the 2-year transition. The problem, of course, is that the provision in the withdrawal agreement to ask for an extension terminates at the end of this month. Institute for Government produced a paper last week called Securing More Time, which looked at other options if both sides decided later that they might want a bit of extra time for negotiation, implementation, or ratification, and concluded that actually, if you lose this easy option, it's extraordinarily complicated. It would be tantamount really to negotiating another separate international agreement with the EU. The EU would have to find a treaty base to do it. The Article 50 treaty base is probably no longer available, has been turned off at the end of that period. So I think it's politics that the government wants. They've talked a lot about regulatory flexibility after transition. That's something, if you have a look at the Centre for Brexit Policy now, chaired by Owen Paterson, something they've been stressing is one of the big gains from ending transition. They've been extraordinarily unclear about what regulatory flexibility they want. But one of the big areas of difference between the government and the EU, and where the government may want to do something differently, is on state aid, where they had to get their bailout schemes approved by the EU. That happened very quickly, as it did for other EU countries, but they may want to do things that wouldn't pass muster with the EU as they try and prop up the economy as it comes out of COVID-19 after the end of transition.
Thanks, Jill. So I wonder if you could just cast a bit of light on the issue specifically about environmental standards, because the government's made great play of its commitment to high environmental standards. There's lots of very good stuff in the manifesto. It's kind of quite clear that a lot of the ministers we're dealing with are very sincere about their commitment to the environment. And they've kind of almost promised non-regression. They've said our standards will be as good or better than they were when we were in the EU. But there is an absolute refusal to talk about non-regression in legal terms, let alone a level playing field. I wonder if you see some sort of bridge specifically on the environment between what the EU wants, which is no environmental dumping, and what the UK wants, which is regulatory freedom but strong environmental standards.
So I think the problem, I think actually one of the things that's quite interesting in these EU negotiations is that there are areas where the two sides find it relatively easier to agree on substance than on principle. And the environment is one of those. I mean, the UK has said we want the freedom to diverge upwards. That from an EU point of view is not a problem. They're worried about the UK leading a race to the bottom and forcing their standards down if the UK has very good market access. But the principle that the UK is saying is basically, you shouldn't do a special case for us. We're actually just another sovereign nation like Canada, Japan. So they've lifted the provisions out of the Canada deal on environment and social protections, which are quite weak commitments. They're basically saying, trust us on this. We'll meet our international commitments. We're going to be a high standards thing. Don't you understand? We're going to be a high standards country. What they don't want is what the EU want, which are firm commitments. Michael Gove has hinted he'll accept non-regression, though that's not in the UK draft at the moment. But the EU proposal does two things, one of which it proposes a ratchet, which David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, explained at some length in the Lords, which means that if both sides raise their standards from where they are at the end of the transition, then the UK could not reduce back below the new EU standard if that is slightly below the UK standard, or below the UK standard if that's higher than the EU one, which is sort of thing. The other thing they don't want is they don't want the EU's proposals on enforcement. The EU wants breach of environmental standards, not meeting up to those commitments, to be subject to dispute resolution mechanisms. The UK is saying these sorts of things aren't subject to dispute resolution mechanisms in other trade agreements. They're not in your Canada agreement, so we don't want it to be subject to dispute resolution. What we'll do is, if you're worried about something, we'll have a chat in the joint committee and see what we do. So those are big issues of principle, because the mantra we get from both David Frost and Michael Gove repeatedly is we want to be a sovereign nation, we want to have regulatory autonomy, and we don't want to be tied into the EU's regulatory orbit. What the EU is trying to do is to constrain the UK's ability to do things differently and better. We don't want the EU sitting in judgment on our own domestic way that we choose to regulate things. But don't worry, because we're committed to be a high standard thing. You can see this in the arguments about, you know, will we add a reference to the Paris Agreement into the trade agreement. The EU wants that. The UK's asked for climate change to be in the US trade agreement, but the UK is saying, no, we don't need that. You don't need to have these references in there because, we're not that sort of nation, but we're not going to tie ourselves down there. So I think this is an area where on substance, the two sides aren't necessarily very apart on the actual what the standards look like, but on the principles, they're miles apart, and that's what could scupper a deal.
Great, really interesting, Jill. Thanks. I think we can come back to a lot of that. If I can turn now to David and moving on from Jill's last point about the potential for a deal being scuppered. If there isn't a deal, or if there's only a very shallow deal, what will be the consequences of that for the environment?
Well, let me start giving you a little sketch of the kind of deal which would be helpful for the environment. It would be a deal which, on the one hand, encouraged and built trust. So there could be active cooperation around what the standards are in the UK and in Europe, and in our joint management of transboundary issues, oceans and air pollution, climate change, and cooperation at a global level as well. The UK and the EU are very important players in a number of the negotiations going on right now around biodiversity, climate change, and the UK is hosting COP26 next year in partnership with the Italians. So we need, just to start with, a high level of cooperation and trust to make that relationship work. Then at a second level, we need a number of quite concrete things. Jill's mentioned non-regression, and however that's achieved, both sides need to be confident that that is part of a deal. And we need a number of quite specific things. For example, a commitment to sustainability in the exploitation of fish. At the moment, that isn't present either in the UK's domestic legislation proposals or in the UK's proposals for the deal. So it's not there at the moment, and it could be there if we had a deal. We need cooperation around emissions trading. I think everyone knows that. It's a bit like Jill's been saying about the practice. But at the moment, we don't have that. We don't have a clear sense of how chemicals will be regulated. And in fact, probably from an environmental point of view, this is an area where we need alignment and quite concrete forms of agreement. So all that's up in the air. And at the moment, I think the danger for the environment is that we may not get to that place of both trust, cooperation, and practical agreements. Because of the gap between the two sides, the chance of no deal has increased, according to most pundits, given the gap and the fairly strong language we've seen. We have the danger also that there could be a rushed and compressed deal towards the end of the year. And that means that non-economic issues are more likely to be squeezed. So some of the environmental issues which are not perhaps critical to some of the negotiators will be squeezed out. Less room for civil society to participate or offer any sort of opinion, and indeed less chance for public scrutiny generally. And also some confusing messages about whether the US is more important than the EU. And in environmental terms, the EU is a very great deal more important than the US in terms of our future. And then finally, there's questions about whether the UK is really prepared for the sort of post-transition period in environmental terms. For example, we haven't really got the domestic ETS system fully up and running. It's not clear whether it will be by the end of the year, and we certainly haven't got the new environmental legislation in place, which I think Maria's going to talk about later. So there are hazards from an environmental point of view of this state of affairs, and hazards if there's not a pathway out of here, and therefore hazards if some kind of extension is ruled out.
Thanks, David, that's very clear. So hazards on climate action, hazards on emissions trading, on chemical safety, on fisheries conservation. I think you could also add the impact that moving to WTO terms of trade, the impact that would have on farming, particularly upland farming. So I guess the question is a no deal in 1st of January 2021 any less dangerous for the environment than the no deal in 2019, which caused all sorts of outcry and political debate and it had a lot of energy behind preventing it, and yet now we seem to be sort of sleepwalking into the possibility of a no deal?
Yes, I think many of the hazards remain the same. Some are different because we have got a settlement in Northern Ireland, if everyone sticks to that, which was not in place before. So there is an arrangement there. But of course, that arrangement does involve a different environmental regime in some respects, for example, in emissions trading, than in the rest of the UK. So that in itself is a non-trivial topic. But in other ways, you're right that a lot of the things that we were expressing concern about in terms of the no deal, especially the non-cooperation, the mechanisms not there, disruption to trade. I mean, it's going to be quite difficult to have an environmentally progressive agricultural policy focusing on public goods, which is one of the very welcome announcements by the government in recent years, if we're in the middle of a highly disruptive market for agricultural goods, having spent our money on supporting farmers, trying to sort out what to do with sheep, which can't be exported, and so forth. So it's not helpful, a no deal on that.
Thanks, David. So just a reminder to the audience that if you want to pose a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If I can turn now to Maria and ask a question less about no deal than about assuming that there is the transition period ends on the 31st of December as the government plans. Will we have suitable environmental governance in place across the UK to uphold environmental laws?
Thanks, Shaun. As things stand, the simple answer is no. So getting straight to the point, the Environment Bill that's before the Westminster Parliament will not fill the governance gap. And the governance gap fundamentals exist across the United Kingdom, and there are no solutions in place in any parts of the United Kingdom. So that's the situation we're in now. The governance gap is a term that we've used fairly loosely over the past 4 years to focus attention on the legal architecture that both supports and oversees individual environmental rules and standards, especially those mechanisms that enhance the political and legal accountability of EU member states. It's about making institutional arrangements that increase the likelihood that governments will stick with environmental values. And failure to complete a deal means that the weight being borne by our new domestic legislation is greater because of the absence of those joint EU-UK governance arrangements, because of the additional risks posed by potentially other trade deals. And urgency is not good for lawmaking. So that urgency that we're faced with again in this process is not good for scrutiny. COVID exacerbates the challenges, and I'll come back to that in a second. But let's assume that the Environment Bill isn't openly abandoned or openly weakened. At least 3 key governance issues need improving, and this will apply across the United Kingdom with different details. First, the target setting framework in the Environment Bill allows for regression, and it completely fails to structure itself around environmental progress, which it could do. Second, the environmental principles will not have the legally binding pervasive effect that they have in EU law. And third, the Office for Environmental Protection could be something very, very special, but it could be a massive distraction if it is not sufficiently active, and it might be inactive for a number of reasons at the moment. The underpinning architecture is what converts promises into reality. All else flows from part 1 of the bill. Now, as framework legislation, the current version of the Environment Bill could be used very positively, but it would also be entirely consistent with a deregulatory agenda. And at a time when COVID is raising very serious questions about rule of law and democracy, as if we weren't all sufficiently by the Brexit process, environmental governance is part of the democratic and rule of law underpinnings of the state. That's why populist governments around the world dislike environmental law. So what needs to be done before the end of the year? First of all, this is legislation for a generation and it needs to be better. Second, some interim measures are probably necessary, just as they were at the earlier no-deal moments. Third, statutory instruments still need careful analysis, detailed scrutiny from the environmental community. Regulations are going to be laid that allow for a swift departure from EU case law. The failure to properly retain EU environmental law is deeply worrying. Fourth and final, whatever shape the Environment Act emerges in, its operation and its implementation needs to be scrutinised well beyond the end of this year. Partly because most of the Act only comes into force if the Secretary of State says it comes into force. But more interestingly, it's well known in law that what we call repeat players, the corporations, the powerful actors who use law again and again and again, these repeat players play a long game. They don't just play for immediate outcomes, and in that way they shape the law. They shape the rules and they shape the rules of the game. And those repeat players around environmental governance should be the environmental NGO community, working together, working with great care to shape the future of environmental governance within the statutory framework provided over the next few months, we hope. Shaping the enforcement provisions, but also shaping the broader legal stock around, for example, targets, around the monitoring of the implementation of environmental law. So, final word for now, the whole point of the governance gap exercise was to provide a framework to empower civil society in holding the powerful to account. So it's not over in the next year.
Thanks, Maria. And I know your current research is on how well environmental groups are using environmental law. Do you think the environmental community is equipped to face the battles that you're talking about? And is it equipped across the UK as well? Because the environment is a devolved function, and we've got quite used to going to Brussels to fight our battles. Are we equipped in every nation of the UK to fight those battles post the transition period?
The simple answer, but I'll give you the long answer, not the wrong answer. So there are lots and lots of examples of really skilled, really sophisticated, usually collaborative uses of law to make the case for environmental protection. There's lots and lots and lots of that. But as a sector, I think the role of law is somewhat undervalued and less well understood than it might be. And one way of looking at that, and one of the reasons I mentioned this idea that the sector needs to watch the Act, is that there's a bit of a history, and this is not across the board, but there's a bit of a history of getting the legislation, job done, well done everybody, and walk away. Actually, legislation does not execute itself. And yes, some environmental NGOs do watch the Climate Change Act. REACH was another example where there was a massive sort of gathering of environmental groups to make REACH happen. But REACH needed nearly the same level of engagement after it had got through its legislative process as it did before, and it's quite hard to maintain that level of attention. And you know, I don't want to underestimate how extraordinarily resilient the community has been over the last 4 years. It's really quite impressive. But this isn't over on the 1st of January next year. This is a long-term generational thing.
Thanks, Maria. If I could just ask Jill, I know at the Institute for Government you did some work on the devolved aspects of environmental policy. Has the UK government kind of got the fact that the environment is a devolved function, and is devolution working properly for the environment in the kind of post-EU context we're emerging into?
We did do some work on that, a report that was out, but I think it was out about 2 years ago. So there is work going on. Probably quite a lot of the people who are listening from government departments know more about that than I do. There is work going on trying to devise these common frameworks. There are some areas where these are going to be non-binding, other ones where they've agreed that they need legislative common frameworks. So I think the government does sort of know that this is devolved, at least departments do. One of the things that everybody always says is that DEFRA is the department in Whitehall that gets devolution better than any of the other government departments. So that's a thumbs up to all ex-colleagues from DEFRA who are watching in. So I think, you know, they do sort of get the devolution. I think the interesting thing will be, I mean, one of the big test cases I think will be fisheries, which will be a very sort of, you know, contested area potentially on fisheries management. Very interesting, I thought, what David was saying about the lack of any reference to sustainable catches in either side's sort of draft agreement. The EU just wanting basically to preserve the status quo, and the UK wanting to switch to annual negotiations in a completely different way of allocating shares based on zonal attachment. So I think work is there, but it's been quite stalled. There are a lot of complications though, because the Scottish government in particular is very allergic to, Scottish government colleagues may want to complain about this, very allergic to anything which suggests there's such a thing as the UK internal market that would give the sort of, you know, reasons for, as they would say it, I think Westminster to interfere in what they want to do. But the interesting thing I think for the devolves to think about is that they risk ending up being English rule takers if they don't sort of get some sort of other governance in place, because within the UK, England is so predominant. That's one reason why we can't have a sort of normal, you know, federal system. England is so predominant that most business would end up following English rules and effectively exporting those in the same way as, you know, the UK outside the EU risks being a rule taker because the global world trades on one of the sort of three big regulatory hegemon standards, and the nearest one to us is the EU, so we risk being a rule taker in any case when we're outside the EU. So I think there are some risks for the devolved if these aren't properly put in place and there's not proper governance constructed around them, which there have been some interesting thoughts from the Welsh government, but we haven't seen anything interesting on the government side from the UK government.
Thanks. So before we come on to the questions, just follow up one of Maria's points with you, David. Maria mentioned REACH. I think you mentioned it as well. A really sophisticated system of ensuring chemical safety. Can we be sure of the safety of chemicals in the UK on the 1st of January next year as we move to the Health and Safety Executive taking over responsibilities?
Well, I think the concerns on the environment side are that the proposals we've got on the table at the moment don't guarantee access to the large safety database which is stored in Helsinki in the HQ of REACH, the chemicals regime in Europe. So the UK would be doing its assessment of the profile of chemicals and their impact on the basis of a more impoverished and limited evidence base, and this is you know, potentially a major concern. And there's also a concern that if we have a regime which is different from REACH, the main point of it, it's difficult to see the point of a regime that's different from REACH unless it's more liberal, and therefore is the danger of attracting chemicals which would be unacceptable under REACH into the UK. So I think that's why we have a lot of questions, and I think those who specialise in chemicals, which I don't, are all pretty convinced, and people I've spoken to in the industry don't seem to disagree particularly, that remaining in REACH would be the best solution.
Thanks, David. And I think we're certainly now, the government is certainly clearly aiming for associate membership of REACH, which is progress. Sarah, you've been looking at the questions. What have you got?
Right, yes, so the first question from participants will go with the potential consequences of extending the transition period and then potentially allowing a US deal to be agreed perhaps before the EU one. We know environmentalists are very concerned around the potential impacts of what a US deal could mean for the environment, and perhaps having an extension would have implications for the order and sequencing of which these deals are agreed. So what do panellists think about that?
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess that if the transition period ends without a deal anyway, and the UK goes on to so-called WTO terms, it makes it, the urgency of getting a US deal becomes that much greater. David, do you want to kick off with a response?
Yes. One of the difficulties of the US deal is that the current regime in Washington is not noted for its enthusiasm for the environment, and we've already seen quite a bit of discussion about the place, for example, of climate change in a deal with the US. And I think the UK would like to see references to climate change, and quite some definitive ones in a deal. The US doesn't want this. So in many respects, it would be much better for the US deal not to be pushed through at this moment, a kind of sort of heated discussion in the US, kind of antipathy to Paris, and done at a slower pace, first after the deal with the EU is done, and after the presidential election in November. So I can see, yes, that there could be a danger, but the right solution really is to do the US deal after the EU one, and not to rush the EU deal, not to rush the US deal. But of course, yes, we could see a situation where the US deal was pushed into place.
Perhaps I can ask Jill. Jill, we Greener UK, and I think all the member groups in Greener UK have pretty good relations across government departments. You know, we're even talking constructively to the Treasury these days. It's a good relationship. The one department that's been really hard to get into and to have a really constructive dialogue with has been the Department for International Trade, that priorities, you know, really wants a US trade deal, kind of come what may. Should environmentalists and should farmers be worried about prioritising a US trade deal over an EU deal?
Sorry. Yeah. Yes, I think they probably should. Yeah, whether it's objectively better for the economy and stuff like that. I mean, we've had the government's assessment, which shows that actually a US trade deal doesn't do very much for the economy at all, even after quite a long period. And the government was open enough to publish that assessment. They've clearly, under this government, refused to publish any assessment of an EU deal. But I think David's right. From an environmentalist point of view, the EU is going to, put the biggest flaw under standards, if you like. I wouldn't expect that in any other deal. Nobody else in a trade deal is going to be asking for similar provisions to the ones that the EU are keen to seek, and they're keen to seek that particularly because the UK has been an EU member and because of geographic proximity. But we know that the big US offensive ask in trade negotiations, talk about offensive and defensive points. The big US offensive ask is on agriculture. That's what they want. That's where they've been very frustrated with the EU, with the lack of access for US agriculture, and the failure of the EU even to abide by WTO judgment that on things like growth hormone, that these things are safe to eat. So I think there's a risk, even if there isn't a trade deal, if the US hadn't sort of wrecked the appellate procedures in the WTO, they could be taking on the UK as an early battering ram into the EU market by making us picking us off once we're outside the EU as a bit of a test case about standards anyway. But I think clearly the farmers are very worried about the consequences of a US deal, but also potential deals with others. If you look at Australia, if you look at New Zealand, other potential candidates for early trade deals, they also basically are agricultural exporters, and that is the sort of area they will want access. So I think from an environmental point of view and from a farm industry point of view, doing the EU first is better. Of course, if we extend the transition, you could make more progress in negotiating deals with other countries, but you can't finalize them, because one of the conditions of being in transition is we can negotiate, but we can't sign other trade deals until we've actually formally exited transition.
Thanks, Jill. And David, just presumably if we did a deal first with the US, it would make it that much harder to get a deal with the EU and to trade, particularly in agricultural goods, with the EU.
Well, I think Jill's right. I mean, if we conceded on the US aggression, as it were, on the sort of agri-food front, it would make it harder with the EU, because we're talking here about some standards which the Commission fought for years and years and years, and there's been very painful political deals done with inside the EU to come up with a kind of compromise on GMOs and hormones, for example. So they're not going to be at all keen to unstitch those. So yeah, this couldn't be more sensitive subjects, really.
Great, thanks. So Sarah, more questions, and I'll come on to Maria for the next round.
Sure. Well, one, I mean, Jill alluded to the fact that climate change is perhaps being caught in the crossfire of sort of broader political disagreements. So we had a question in about how could a poor deal or no deal at all impact the UK's ability to tackle climate change and increase ambition and particular advocacy efforts ahead of COP26 next year.
So who wants to go with that? Uncomfortable looks. There we are. Jill, you move first. Just wave.
I mean, the UK has always actually had, relatively ambitious domestic policies on climate change. So I think formally losing that part of in a trade deal, I'm not sure we need a trade deal to force us to do things on climate change. Led the way on various things on that. I think the interesting impact, though, is what's the impact of if we have a disruptive no trade deal exit. There's going to be some disruption anyway, even with the sort of deal that Boris Johnson wants with the EU. But if we have the economy taking multiple hits, I think the interesting question is, actually what pressures does that put on government? Does it go faster in accelerating a green recovery? Or does it mean that it actually looks at ways of alleviating costs, postponing things and stuff like that? Because the one thing that a disruptive no deal exit would do, or indeed the transition to the Johnson deal, then is take an economic hit. So I think it's mainly through that effect. The other thing I think, as David said, is they need to be doing massive international diplomacy in the run up to the COP. That's been quite stymied at the moment by the fact of preoccupation with COVID, but also the fact that nobody can do any of that sort of face-to-face diplomacy that the French did huge amounts in the run-up to their COP. So I think there is a problem of being perceived to be a sort of bit of an international pariah if you're then trying to sort of lead the world to a new future, and I think that would be quite difficult. So and you'd have a very preoccupied government that doesn't have a lot of natural allies to bring with it, and it will need to be cooperating very closely with the EU, who are our closest allies on climate change, if we're going to get anywhere there.
Thanks, Jill. And E3G have just produced a very good paper making the case that the UK and the EU really need to be working together to ensure a successful COP26. And at the moment, there seems to be such bad blood between them, particularly on this issue in the negotiations, that it seems to be risking that. I don't know if David or Maria, either of you want to comment further on this, and David, perhaps also on the ETS, because I think that's going to increase the costs of decarbonisation, as I understand it.
Yes, and I think, and I agree with what Jill said entirely. At a more kind of operational level, it's important to maintain cooperation in running the energy supply system on both sides of the channel, not least if we want a more ambitious development of renewables, because with increasing share of renewables on the grid, there is an issue with intermittency, and therefore needing a broader base of supplies you can possibly get. A more linked up system is better, allows you to have more renewables more cheaply. Therefore, the UK has got a particularly strong interest, if we want to have a renewables-based economy and having a very connected set of systems. Therefore, we do want cooperation around energy policy and around some disciplines that go with that, the connectors working. And it does make sense for us, as well as the EU, to have the same carbon price, so that we don't get perverse investments moving around to take advantage of lower prices. We very much need that for sort of post-COVID recovery. And as part of that, if the UK is having a separate ETS, which is the proposal that's emissions trading system from the EU, we do need those two systems to be aligned, if possible, working the same carbon price, giving the same message, both to industry and to suppliers. So actually, in operational terms, in making a kind of green recovery, a longer term renewables future work, we need some quite practical cooperation around around our proximity. We're not very far away from the continent. We are not Canada, it turns out. So it's just an example of you can defer that discussion, but that's going to be damaging and unhelpful.
Thanks, David. Maria?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, obviously I agree with all of that. I didn't quite catch the question, to be honest, but I'm assuming it's something along the lines of no deal and climate. And
Sarah, do you want to just repeat?
Fine, it's fine. I've not got much to add anyway. So it's precisely this point that our domestic systems are more important in the absence of collaboration with the European Union. So our domestic systems need to be much, much improved very, very quickly. That's not easy, and scrutiny goes missing in cases of urgency. The other thing to add to what David was just saying is that whenever people are talking about the green recovery, it's very climate focused. Now, obviously that's crucial, it must be climate focused, but there are a whole load of other nature and environment crises that also need to be addressed. And I see very little of that in the discussion of the green recovery. The governance principles are part of the green recovery because we need to recover in a democratic, rule of law based way.
Thanks, Maria. Sarah, more questions?
Yeah, so actually on that, I got a question ahead of time about what progress needs to be made to ensure that the environmental principles will be applied consistently and robustly across the UK. So I wonder whether Maria could say something on that one.
Yeah, Maria, and also the across the UK aspect, because as I understand it, each administration is going to come up with its own version of the environmental principles.
Yeah, and the environmental principles are not a single thing. They are global phenomena that are understood and used differently in all jurisdictions. In the EU, they are crucially legal principles and they are pervasive and systemic. So there is no sign anywhere in the United Kingdom that will be replaced ever, let alone in time for leaving the transition period. So if we look at the Environment Bill specifically, and I know that the other nations are saying they're going to do a better job than that, although we haven't seen which better job they're going to do yet. If we look at the Environment Bill specifically, it is extraordinarily weak. It leaves the meaning of the principles in the hands of the Secretary of State, not in the hands of the courts, as they are at the moment. The meaning of the principles is in the hands of the Secretary of State, with few constraints on what they mean. And even then, they are simply things that ministers only, not everybody, must have regard to in making policy. So there's very, very little there. There's very little for us to get our hands around with respect to the principles. I cannot, to be perfectly honest, imagine simple amendments to the bill that would make the principles work. I really think that battle has been lost. All that we need to be clear on is that this is not equivalent to what we had before. This is weak, this is poor. And so what needs to be done is regardless of what the Environment Act ends up saying, we argue that principles are important political features of the world that should be driving environmental behaviour in the United Kingdom because of their status in international law, because of even this weak policy status. But the question, I think, was what changes need to be made to make them work. Well, it needs to be completely rewritten with a completely different premise, and we start again. I can't imagine that's going to happen at this point.
And can people in England look to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and see them getting it right?
Well, I don't know yet. I mean, we don't know yet, do we? So, I mean, yes, Wales have this beautiful piece of legislation that certainly is doing some work around these issues, and that's probably all we can ask. It does some work around these issues. So yes, let's hope we can look to better approaches in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But they don't get off the hook just because the Environment Bill's so bad. They still need to do something.
So come what may, on the 1st of January next year, none of the countries of the UK will have adequate environmental governance in place, and none of them will have an inadequate set of environmental principles. Is that what you're saying?
Something miraculous might happen between now and then, but as things stand, no. And you know, you were referring to this idea that we're resigned about leaving this single market, etc., at the end of the year. We somehow have lost sight of this because we've all got so excited about the rest of the Environment Bill that we've forgotten that the underpinning governance architecture that holds the whole of the rest of the structure up is not finished.
We're going to end this hour on a hugely upbeat and optimistic note, I promise.
Oh yes, let's please.
Sarah, another question, and if panelists want to sort of wave at me if they want to come in, then please do. But Sarah, another question for now.
Well, I'll do two actually. So just following up from that question, you mentioned about the need for ENGOs to stay engaged on the bill. I mean, what are the other aspects you think that we must particularly keep an eye on, apart perhaps from the principles? And then just a question we got in advance, just will fish derail everything? That's in relation to the separate negotiations on fisheries. So
I think Jill wants to come in on fish.
I'm happy to do fish. So the political declaration, which was the thing that was signed up to alongside the withdrawal agreement back in October, said both sides will use their best endeavours to do a deal on fish by the end of this month. I think both sides have now said they don't think they are going to do that, but this is one of the areas where at the moment they are completely miles apart. Michel Barnier and the Commission asked for a mandate that would give them some degree of flexibility on fish to move away from current, the shares currently fixed as now by the CFP. Member states refused to do that. He went back to fisheries ministers last week. They told him to stick with his current mandate. He spoke to 8 fisheries countries because obviously the interests in the fishing deal are very specific to individual countries. Unfortunately, those are quite some big players, and clearly any deal has to be agreed unanimously in the EU. The UK basically offers 4 pages of text, which they say is based on the Norway agreement, and just says we'll negotiate every year as an independent coastal state, and we're not giving you any assurances beyond that. So at the moment, it looks like a complete standoff on fish. Fish is a trivial part of the UK economy. It's a trivial part of the EU economy, but it is sort of totemic, and both sides say they will potentially walk away if there is no decent deal on fish. That said, the story out of the negotiations is that there is some movement behind the scenes on fish, whether that's the UK offer, the EU beginning to say it will talk about a zonal attachment as opposed to historic shares, on the UK potentially offering some comfort to the EU on we won't snatch back everything straight away, we'll give you some degree of certainty, whatever. So whether President Macron faces elections next year can sell that to French fishermen, whether the Conservatives, point being made at a UK and Changing Europe event last week, can sell whatever deal they do back in Scotland, where they face Holyrood elections next year and want to do quite well, different matters. So fish could still be a deal breaker, but it is one of those areas where you feel that it would be so Muppet-like not to do a deal. It's economically much less significant than everything else. And the key thing about fish is we're talking about access to waters, but both sides need access to the other's markets, because the UK basically doesn't like consuming UK fish. We like consuming fish that's caught elsewhere. And a lot of our fishers, so there's quite a big division, but a substantial proportion of our fishers need rapid access, tariff-free access, quick access to EU markets, because that's where they sell their fish. That's enough fish.
Thanks, Jill. So, David, Maria, do you want to just give your sort of top improvement for the bill, Maria, first?
So I understood that as being 2 different things. One about the bill, but also about the Act. So after the bill. For the bill, if we're looking for one single amendment for this hundreds of pages long bill, it would be a non-regression clause, a serious, substantive, enforceable non-regression clause. Wouldn't solve all the problems, but it'd be a big help. After the Act has been passed, environmental groups need to be repeat players. Repeat players shape the rules. So if environmental groups are disciplined and work together and make things happen, they will shape the way the OEP works. They will choose their complaints carefully, they will follow through their complaints carefully, they will judicially review carefully, and they will make the OEP into a creature that will do good for the environment. But it's not just about the OEP, they will also look really, really carefully at this imperfect but important framework of target setting, reviewing, reporting, reviewing again, answering. It's far from perfect, but working together, that can be made better even if the legislation is flawed. Same with the monitoring of the implementation of environmental law. No hard-edged legal rules, nothing binding, but you can do a lot of work through those provisions, including doing something with the principles. It won't be good enough, but doing something with principles. So I think starting now to think about what comes next is quite important.
Thanks, Maria. And the point about non-regression is interesting, because the government has consistently said it won't regress from current standards and consistently refused to put that in law, which is a bit of
they don't want their hands to be bound, but that's what law and institutions are. You know, that's the point, that it binds people's hands, and presumably that was part of the attraction of leaving the European Union, that the European Union is full of institutions and rules that control processes.
Thanks, Maria. David, do you have a top improvement for the bill? And then I'm going to round up. I think we're sort of out of time, so I'm going to ask people to round up. You're muted.
I agree that non-regression is very important, and I'd just like to emphasise to the importance of getting the whole system of targets, long-term targets, to be as effective as possible, to make sure those targets are supported by the right sort of structure, that interim targets are probably binding, that we have the right system to establish them over the right timetable. Outside the EU, we will need that kind of framing and level of certainty, which we have not had traditionally in domestic policy.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to ask each panelist just to have a really snappy answer to this next question before we round up. And I just want to ask Jill first, then David, then Maria. Are we going to get a deal? And should we be, as environmentalists, optimistic about the deal we're going to get and the brave new world we're going to enter on the 1st of January next year?
Okay, no idea whether we'll get a deal or not. We asked a bunch of academics, most of them thought with no transition there'd be no deal. I would be slightly more optimistic, but actually I think environmentalists are focusing in absolutely the wrong place if they obsess about, the only way we can save the environment is through the deal with the EU. If the environment becomes something we're only looking after because we were forced into some compliance in the EU trade deal, you're on the back foot immediately, everybody hates it or whatever. There are huge opportunities to bring this back home. This is a nation that I think is very pro-environment. We, I think, have suffered from seeing high environmental standards as an EU imposition. So I think you guys ought to now actually be seeing the fact that this is domestic legislation. These are domestic actions. It's not done somewhere away from that in Brussels, and use that to mobilise and drive the UK to be an environmental leader.
Thank you. And I've just seen a question aimed at me from Jonathan Leake of the Sunday Times, why I want to end on an optimistic note when there appears to be nothing to be optimistic about. But I have to remain sunny in this job, and I think Jill's sort of challenge there to kind of get things right at the UK level is a good one. David?
I don't know if we'll get a deal either. There was a story in the Times yesterday with a slightly more upbeat version of the scope for compromise, and maybe that's there. It's something that we're probably not going to find out very quickly, I suspect. I take Jill's point that we very much need to, feel that the UK is a sort of proud and effective environmental actor, but it has to act that way too. And that means that we've got to get the kind of foundations in place. And a lot of what we've been talking about today is linked to an EU deal. It's really about a new set of foundations in the UK as well, which we can all believe in and feel are the right basis for going forward. And that includes things like in the trade bill and having some ability to look at the environmental aspects of government policy across the piece. So I think it's quite difficult for environmentalists to kind of ignore the fact we've had a kind of architecture that's going, and we don't know what the new one is. We need that good architecture now. It's not the be all or end all by any manner of means. We need the right goals, the right outlook, the right resources, the money for the Chancellor, but we need all that architecture. It's going to be hard for us to overlook that.
Thank you. And Maria?
So you're not likely to end on an optimistic note if you end with me, so that's okay. So also, no idea whether we'll get a deal, although I doubt we'll get a good, sophisticated, well-scrutinised, highly participative deal. And the energetic impetus at the domestic level, I agree with Jill, that's a really important point. The thing I would say to focus on now is the degradation of our institutions. Environmental law, environmental governance is part of and is underpinned by democracy. It is underpinned by people. It isn't something that's done to people. And so if we focus on the broader institutions of democracy, as well as the specific environmental governance principles that we need to put in place, that is a crucial thing for the next generation.
Thanks, Maria. And whether this is an optimistic note or not, I think the last hour has shown that these things still matter, and there are still really important battles to be fought over the manner in which we end the transition period and fully exit the European Union. And they're as important now as they were a year ago. So we need to raise the profile and get it right and improve the bills and improve the governance across all 4 nations of the UK. So I'd like to thank our panelists very much indeed. In a normal meeting, we'd give them a round of applause. You just need to imagine thousands of people applauding you now. So thanks very much. I'd like to thank the audience tuning in, the Green UK and Green Alliance teams, Sarah, Ollie and others for fixing the debate. We have another Green Alliance event tomorrow at 4 o'clock on will the recovery from COVID-19 be green and just. That's with Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and Chair of the Elders, and Lord Stern. So I hope you can register for that. And we will be turning this debate into a podcast towards the end of the week, and also putting it on Green Alliance's YouTube channel. So please have a look out for that. So thanks all very much indeed. Have a good day.